Margaret, thanks very much for being here. I wonder if you could start by, sketching the scene, what the world was like in 1919 when the leaders of many great countries gather in Paris to remake the world.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me to Pandemonium U. It's an extraordinary experience, and I'm struck by just how quickly we've somehow adapted to this strange world we're in, and you and Pamela setting up Pandemonium U have made a huge difference, I think. What I'd like to do, if I may, is just start by showing two maps, which gives you an idea of the impact of the Paris Peace Conference, and they only show Europe, and they'll give you a sense of just how much things changed between 1914 and 1919. And many of those changes are still with us today. This is Europe in the Great War. You just note the shape of the countries. You can see which are on which side. A very big Russia, a very big Germany, a huge multinational empire called Austria-Hungary. And then look at what happened by 1919 and how different it is. Russia is much smaller. Austria-Hungary has vanished. Germany is smaller. France is a bit bigger. And their whole host of new countries have appeared. Yugoslavia, Poland has reappeared on the map of Europe, and there's a new country called Czechoslovakia. And this doesn't even begin to show what's happening elsewhere around the world, in Turkey, in what used to be the Ottoman Empire. And so it's an enormously important moment in world history, and we still really, I think, are living with many of the consequences. Well, the peacemakers who met in Paris in 1919 for this extraordinary conference were at the time and have been blamed since for not getting it right, for not making a lasting peace. And a lot of people have blamed them for the Second World War. I would disagree, because I think what they were dealing with was a range of problems which probably nobody could have successfully concluded. Let me give you just a sense of what the world was like in 1919. Europe had just come through a war that was worse than anything Europe had endured, certainly since the Napoleonic Wars, which ended in 1815. And probably it was even worse than the great religious and dynastic wars of the 30 Years' War. Europe, much of it lay in misery. Economic structures had collapsed. In Vienna, which was one of the richest cities in the world, people were starving. The Red Cross was trying to feed them. Empires had disappeared. Russia, which was an empire as well as a huge country, had fallen to pieces. It had had a Bolshevik revolution in the fall of 1917 and was engaged now in a civil war. And a number of countries around the periphery of Russia were detaching themselves and trying to stake out their independence, such as the Baltic countries and the countries in the Caucasus, and of course, Poland, part of which had been absorbed into the Russian Empire. It was not just that Europe was shattered in many ways, that old regimes had fallen. In Germany, there'd been a revolution. Austria-Hungary had literally disappeared, as those maps showed. It had disappeared off the map. And there were a number of forces in the world which were very difficult for anyone, even great powers, to deal with. Bolshevism, the revolutionary force in Russia, had set off a whole series of similar revolutions around the world. And so there were revolutions in Hungary, for example. There was a Bolshevik government, a communist government, for 6 months in Hungary from 1919 to 1920. There was a communist government in Bavaria. It only lasted a week, but it seemed to many people an indication that what was left of Europe was trembling on the edge of anarchy, violent revolution. And I think this, you have to understand about the circumstances in which they met in Paris. What was also happening, of course, was that a number of nations, peoples who had once been independent nations and peoples who wanted to be nations, wanted to establish their own countries on the ground. It was a time of nationalism, largely ethnic nationalism, and the hope was for self-determination. And so what the peacemakers were dealing with in Paris, the representatives of the powers who met there, was a force, two forces actually, one Bolshevism, revolutionary socialism, and the other ethnic nationalism, which were very difficult to contain. These are the sorts of forces that make people want to die for them. These are things that mobilize people. These are things that give people purpose, give them goals to try and achieve. And I think what is also important is that over a lot of Europe, there was still fighting, still a lot of violence. We tend to think that on November the 11th, 1918, the First World War came to an end, and that was an end to the fighting. In fact, fighting was going to go on in the center of Europe, in the Caucasus, in parts of course, Russia, Ukraine, and also in parts of the Middle East, well into the mid-1920s. And so there was, I think, a sense that the world, not just Europe, but perhaps the world as a whole, was trembling on the edge of something. And perhaps to add to that sense was the great influenza pandemic, which had started probably, we now think, sometime at the end of 1916, but was reaching its full height in 1918, 1919, perhaps carrying off as many as 50 million people around the world. And so I think there was a sense that the world was really in terrible trouble. And I think what's also important to remember, and this is not to excuse those who are making peace, what's important to remember is that their strength was ebbing. You know, they had huge armies. I mean, the victorious powers had met in Paris in January 1919. They had enormous power. They represented some of the most powerful nations in the world, but that strength was ebbing. Their governments and their peoples didn't want to go on supporting those enormous armies and navies and the new air forces. And so bit by bit, the capacity of the powers in Paris to actually influence events on the ground was ebbing. And they were aware of it. Things were happening in the middle of Turkey, for example, and they couldn't get the troops there. Things were happening in the middle of Europe and they didn't know how to get the troops or the forces there.
Margaret,
Sorry.
Just quickly, I mean, tens of millions of people are dying off stage, as it were, many of them soldiers.
Yeah.
Is there any awareness, or is there a strong awareness of this, and is it directly affecting the situation and the decision making?
Do you know, this is something I've been wondering about, and there's been a lot of speculation about. I don't think it did, and this seems very curious because people were dying, but people were used to death in 1919. So many men had died in the First World War, and a number of civilians had also died as a result of starvation or diseases that were linked to lack of nutrition. 9 million men possibly had died in the war, and so people dying was not something that shocked people. And what I think is really striking, there's very little mention of it in the literature of the time. There's very little mention afterwards. Artists don't write about it, painters don't paint about it. It seems to be something that people simply took in their stride. And then of course the pandemic disappeared. And so it doesn't seem to me, but I may be wrong, it doesn't seem to me that it actually played a very large part. So I think what was also happening is that wartime alliances were falling apart, and that always happens at the end of great wars. And people come together for a cause. It's like a big demonstration, a big protest. And then when it's over, when you've won your point, then you begin to disagree about what happens next. And that was happening. And so you have a number of people meeting who have very different goals. And that I think is important to remember. It was, I think, the most extraordinary event, and we'll never see anything like it again. I mean, can you imagine the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Britain, the Prime Minister of France, the Prime Minister of Italy, can you imagine them all staying in one city for 6 months, talking to each other? I mean, just unthinkable. And the G7, G20 last, what, 2.5 days at the most. This is a slide of the opening of the conference. There were some 30 plus countries represented at the peace conference. You will notice that all the representatives are men. There were very few women involved in those days in politics or in the civil services or in the military. And so these were men, and they had come from around the world. It was one of the first times that countries such as Japan and Thailand had been represented at big international conferences. China was also represented. China and Japan were both allies of Britain, France, and the United States in the First World War. A lot of Latin American countries had come as well, and parts of the British Empire, my own country, Canada, were coming in their own right. And so this was a major international gathering. And it was a bit like a sort of pot of honey attracting bees, because if you wanted something done, you would go to Paris, because that's where the concentration of power was. And so you had not only the representatives of all these countries, but you had people coming who had petitions, who wanted something to happen. And so you had women coming to ask for votes for women. You had African Americans, the great African American leader, W.E.B. Du Bois, came to try and ask for greater rights for his people. Colonial peoples came to try and ask for independence. Some of you probably know the story. There was an obscure, totally unknown man from French Indochina, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, who was working as a waiter in one of the big Paris hotels, and he brought a petition to the conference. He tried to get it seen. We don't know if anyone ever saw it, asking for independence for his little country. And he was ignored, and he went off and decided to get independence in another way. And his name eventually became Ho Chi Minh, And he did indeed lead Vietnam to independence. And so think of this not just as a diplomatic gathering, but it's a concentration of power where the petitioners are coming to try and get something done. What they had, of course, also was the worry about what was happening in Europe. And so in a curious way, they are listening to petitions, they're trying to deal with the defeated, they've got to draw up their treaties, that's what the primary purpose of the conference was. But they also begin to act almost as a sort of world government, because they come together to try and deal with some of the problems, to try and feed the starving Europeans, to try and stop the wars that are going on. What they had thought was this would be a preliminary peace conference. They said, we'll meet, we'll come up with the terms we're going to offer Germany and the 4 other defeated nations, and then we'll call them, and then we'll have a full-scale negotiation. It was so difficult to get the terms drawn up, particularly the German treaty, which I might talk about in a bit if that's okay. It was so difficult to draw up the terms, they didn't get them done until May. And by that point, the conference on a couple of occasions had nearly fallen to pieces. People had walked out or threatened to walk out. And so they simply couldn't open it up again. And so they just handed the terms to the Germans, said, you've got 2 weeks to look at them, we'll take any objections in writing, which is something among the many things the Germans felt later very resentful about. And so it was something that started out as a preliminary conference, and in the end, it just became the real thing. Now, what happened at the conference was it rapidly became clear that it was impossible to do negotiations with 30 plus countries represented. And so what began to happen is the big 3, represented by these 3 men of the United States, Great Britain, and France, formed a smaller group known as the Council of, it was known as the Council of 4 because the Italian Prime Minister was there, but that I think was more of a courtesy. These are the 3 men who really counted. If you're looking at it, the man on the left of the screen is the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who was not known for his expertise in foreign affairs, but was a terrific negotiator, and I think played a very important part in trying to get the other 2 together. The man in the middle is Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, who had rallied France at a very dark day in the war. And I think this was very important for him that the conference be held in Paris. And on the right is Woodrow Wilson, the American president. Each of these men had different goals when they came to Paris. And this is something that always happens in negotiations. What the British had wanted was an end to German naval power, and they'd got it before the conference opened. The German fleet had surrendered and was in British ports. The British also wanted German colonies, and they got those before the peace conference started. And so they could afford to be more magnanimous perhaps towards Germany because they wanted less. But what they did need very much was financing, and I'll come to that later on. What Georges Clemenceau wanted, and what most French wanted, was security. In his lifetime, he had seen France invaded twice by German forces. In 1870, when he was a young man, the German Confederation invaded France, and France was defeated and humiliated and lost its 2 provinces of Alsace and Lorraine. And what Clemenceau wanted was protection, and I think he spoke for many French people against Germany. And what worried him was that Germany was economically powerful and there were more Germans than French. And this worried him and it worried the French. And so he wanted a Germany that was kept under control. He did not want, I think, Germany to be broken up, although there were certainly those in France who argued for that. And then you have Woodrow Wilson, the American president, who came very specifically to say that the United States didn't want anything for itself. In fact, the United States didn't even call itself an ally. It called itself an associated power. And what he wanted was a better world, and a world that would be free of war. And so for him, the prime goal was to set up something called the League of Nations. And this was to be very, very important indeed. And so these are the 3 men who really make the peace settlement. They don't deal with all the details. There are hundreds of committees all over Paris, but they make the big decisions, and they meet often daily throughout these 6 months. And so they get to know each other very well.
Margaret, you describe in the book, they sit in this overheated room. Wilson has the flu some of the time. They get on each other's nerves. They shout at each other. It struck me as a very amateurish way to remake the world.
Well, I think it was. I think it was an improvisation. In fact, a French diplomat said, say an improvisation. My French is hopeless. But he said, they're just making it up as they go along. But it was an unprecedented sort of situation. So I think they were really trying to feel their way through it. And they certainly left a lot of the decisions, Poland's borders, for example, Czechoslovakia's borders, which were approved by the peace conference, were done by separate committees. But they dealt with the big issues, how to deal with Germany, how to create the League of Nations. What they also had to deal with was something which previous conferences of this sort and previous statesmen of this sort had not really had to deal with, and that was public opinion. This is now really an important factor, because you have a mass press. There was something like 700 journalists in Paris reporting on the peace conference. Most of the countries there were democracies, and so they had to think about the next election. And the public's mood was, as is so often the case, complicated. What a lot of people wanted was revenge. If you were French and you'd been there and France had been invaded by Germany, not the other way around, and most of the war on the Western Front was fought on French or Belgian soil, you wanted revenge. You wanted someone to pay for the damage. But what a lot of people at the same time also wanted was a better world. And so you have these very contradictory strains in public opinion, revenge and a better world. And that's something they also had to deal with, those who were trying to make the peace and set up the terms. And so it was, I think, a very complicated situation. And this is not to defend them. I think they made a lot of mistakes, but I just want to set the context. And I think what we always have to do in history is ask, what would we have done? If we'd been there, how would we have done it better? You know, easy to say now they should have done this, and they should have known there was a young German corporal called Adolf Hitler who was going to make a lot of trouble. They didn't know that. They couldn't foresee the future. And so they did their best. And in many cases, it wasn't good enough. So I thought if with your permission, I might go on and talk about the Treaty of Versailles, which was the German treaty.
Yes, please.
Which was the most difficult one. And this is when they finally got it signed. And I think very significant here, if you look at this slide, it's being signed in the Great Hall of Mirrors at the Great Palace at Versailles. And I think often symbols have great importance in human affairs, and this certainly did. This is where, in 1871, the French had signed their treaty with the Germans. And this is where Germany, the new state of Germany, had actually been proclaimed. And so for the French to have Germany sign a treaty, which was essentially a treaty accepting defeat, I think was extremely important. You can see the crowd. It was a huge crowd, people jammed in. There were photographers, even bits of it are caught on the very new medium of cinema photography. And so we have actually a very, very good record of what happened. And this was signed on the 28th of June, 1919. At the time, Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Wilson, who in a funny way had become friendly. I mean, I suppose it's a bit like the Stockholm syndrome. They got so used to being with each other. And they shared problems and responsibilities that nobody else shared. And so they developed a sort of fellow feeling. And when the treaty had been signed and when they stood outside on the terraces to hear the guns fire and the celebrations start, they said to each other, well, we did the best we could. And I think they all felt that. It was only later, of course, and it's easy to see in hindsight, that some of the problems with the German treaty began to emerge. The Germans did not like the treaty. Would you like me to say something about what the treaty was like?
Well, they didn't even, each individual negotiator, none of the Germans wanted to come and sign it. And it was the worst day of his life, one of them said.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult. It was very difficult. Germany had had a revolution by this point, and it was now a republic. The Kaiser had gone off into exile. The Kaiser, who said he'd die at the front of his troops, had gone off into exile in the Netherlands. And that was the end of imperial rule in Germany. This gives you some sense of the German reaction to the treaty. The cartoon shows the powers dividing up. They're creatures out of nightmares dividing up Germany, punishing Germany. And you can see here a huge demonstration in Germany attacking the treaty. Now, why was the treaty so unpopular? And I think there are a number of reasons for that. Partly, I think, because the Germans had expected that they would be treated leniently. They'd had a revolution, and Woodrow Wilson had indicated, perhaps mistakenly, that once the old style of government in Germany went, he would see Germany as a very different country, that he blamed the Kaiser and he blamed what he called Prussianism for Germany's getting into the war. I mean, he blamed Germany for starting the war. But he said to the Germans, you know, once you reform yourselves, then you can become part of the family of nations. And so I think the Germans, a lot of them felt, well, we've got rid of the Kaiser, we've got rid of his regime. we've become a different sort of country. So why should we why should we pay for the sins of the former regime? I think that was one thing. And so I think you got a situation in Germany during the winter of 1918-19. And remember, people were still suffering a lot. And the British blockade had caused real hardships, very great shortage of food, and people were sort of undernourished, and the society seemed to be falling to pieces. And I think a lot of Germans had felt the treaty will be fair. We might even become a bigger country because we might be allowed, Austria, the little German-speaking remnant of Austria-Hungary, might be allowed to join with us. Principle of self-determination, which Wilson and others had talked about. And so I think there was an illusion that somehow Germany was going to be treated very fairly and might even come out rather bigger than it had been in 1914. There was also, I think, increasingly in Germany, and that was really fueled by the German High Command, that Germany hadn't really lost the war. And this is really important. If you don't think you've lost the war, you don't think any treaty that imposes penalties is going to be fair. I mean, people never like losing. You never get anyone going to court and saying, well, the judge was really fair, I did lose. Usually people say, it was totally unfair and I shouldn't have paid any penalty. And the Germans, I think, increasingly felt that they had not lost the war. It was wrong, I think. They had lost the war, but there was a very powerful propaganda being made by the military and their supporters. And it is true that Germany wasn't occupied. Only a very small bit of Germany, the Rhineland, just a little bit west of the Rhine River, was occupied. And so most Germans never really felt the impact of having lost the war, which is why, incidentally, in the Second World War, the Allies decided on unconditional surrender, and they decided they would occupy Germany. They didn't want any doubts the second time around that Germany had lost. And so there was, I think, this illusion, A, of fair treatment, and B, that we hadn't really lost the war. Germany had lost.
Can I just interrupt with one question, Margaret?
Sure.
What was their argument exactly to say that they hadn't lost the war? How could they persuade people of that?
I think what they said, well, there were two things. First of all, Germans didn't experience defeat in the way that they did in the Second World War. So they could, and the troops marched home in good order and were greeted by the new socialist government. In fact, the new president said, "We greet you undefeated." And the second thing that happened is the High Command, who incidentally had panicked in August 1918 when Germany was losing the war and had begged the civilian government to make peace. And indeed, the great General Ludendorff had fled to Sweden wearing false whiskers and civilian clothes. The High Command regained their nerve and they said, we could have fought on. We never meant to ask for peace. The government got it wrong. We were ready to fight on. We were stabbed in the back at home. And we were stabbed in the back, and you can probably guess, any of you here, you can probably guess who they were stabbed in the back by. They were stabbed in the back by liberals, left-wingers, and Jews. It was the beginning of a pernicious myth, which was going to help to undermine the Weimar Republic. And it was going to be enormously destructive. And so there was this belief across the political spectrum, on the right certainly, that Germany hadn't lost. And eventually what began to happen in the 1920s is a whole additional sort of theory grew up that Germany hadn't started the war either. And there was a lot of writing. The Germans had a special office in the foreign ministry that was devoted to promoting the idea that Germany hadn't lost the war. And so for a number of reasons, the Germans felt that I think they would have disliked almost any treaty, but the treaty they got, they absolutely loathed. They called it the Diktat, the dictated treaty. And I think, again, pretty much across the political spectrum, there was an unwillingness to obey its terms. Now, there's a lot of controversy about the treaty, and I won't go into huge detail on it, but perhaps, what do you think? Should I say a couple of things about the nature of the treaty?
Yes, go for it briefly. Yes, we
okay, well, I promise not to go on too much, but I think what is important, because some of the things became very controversial. To begin with, the League Covenant, setting up the League of Nations, was in the treaty. It was in the first part of the treaty, and Germans had to sign it, yet they weren't allowed to join. They were told they could only join when they'd sort of amended their ways and shown that they were better people. And eventually they did join in the 1920s, but that was insulting. They lost territory. Germany became smaller. They lost their colonies. They lost territory to the newly emerging state of Poland. They lost the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine to France, which they themselves had taken after 1871. And so it was a smaller Germany, and I think there was resentment of that. And I think in the case of Poland, I'm afraid there was also a racial component. There was certainly on the right in Germany, resentment that Germans were living under the rule of Slavs, people they felt were inferior. And that was going to be something, of course, that people like Hitler were going to make great play with. Germany was also going to have to disarm. It was only going to have an army of 100,000. It was not meant to have a navy of much size at all. It wasn't meant to have certain types of equipment. It wasn't meant to have an air force. And when the Germans objected, as they did, they were told that, don't worry, we're going to have a general disarmament and one day it'll all be all right. But you can see the German point of view. Why should we disarm if nobody else is? There were also meant to be trials of those who were guilty for starting the war, starting with the Kaiser and going on down through the military and some of the diplomats, and only a few were ever held. But the thing I think that really annoyed the Germans were reparations. And the idea was that Germany would pay for the damage it did to France, to Belgium, on which it had declared war. I think that's always important to remember. And that the Germans felt was deeply unfair, and they felt it was a burden. And the problem, I think, was partly the bill was potentially very high. The Allies knew that Germany would never pay at all. And in fact, the British felt it would be a mistake because it would hurt the German economy and it would therefore hurt the whole European economy. But the Allies didn't dare tell their own publics. And so the Germans faced what seemed like an enormous bill. And I think they resented it enormously. And because they didn't feel they'd lost the war, and because increasingly they didn't feel they'd started the war, they really didn't want to pay it. And the clause, Article 231, in what was a very long treaty that they particularly resented, was the clause which said that Germany and its allies accept responsibility for starting the war. And for the Germans, that was the war guilt clause. And it was something that became very important in nationalist propaganda.
Just to sum up, Margaret, what role do you think this Versailles Treaty played in starting World War II? I know you don't think it's a major role.
It became one of the things that the nationalist right, and of course increasingly that was the Nazis, were able to mobilize opinion around. And it became a sort of symbol of everything they disliked, of everything they hated about the way they'd been treated. And it became something to bludgeon the Allies with. And certainly in Britain, a number of people felt actually the Germans had some arguments on their side. And that helped to feed into appeasement. A lot of British came around to thinking that actually, yes, Germany had been rather badly treated and the reparations had been too heavy and so on. And the French never, for obvious reasons, came around quite to that view in the same way. But certainly in the United States and Canada and the other English-speaking countries and in Britain, there was a sense that Germany perhaps had been too badly treated. I think it's very, very tricky. I mean, some people say that Germany should simply not have paid any penalty. They shouldn't have tried to get reparations. They simply should have tried to get the European economy going again. That's in fact what John Maynard Keynes said, who was a young man at the peace conference. But again, there was that factor of public opinion. And how do you say, Clemenceau said this, he said, how do I say to the French people, we're not going to get anything out of Germany, too bad, we're just going to have to do all our own repairs ourselves. And so it was, I'm not defending it, but I think we have to understand the political difficulties. My own view on the Second World War is the First World War helped to create the conditions, and it helped to give certainly the nationalist right in Germany things to mobilize around. But I think it was really the Great Depression that sent Europe down the road to war. And that helped Hitler and the Nazis get into power. I think without the Depression and without the folly, indeed, of some of the right-wing, more conservative Germans who invited Hitler into power, things might have gone very differently. So I think, a lot happened in 20 years. To say that what happened in 1919 led directly to 1939, my own sense is it doesn't make that much sense.
I was very struck, though, by the passage in which you described the British having regrets about the harshness towards Germany, even during the conference, even just before the Germans signed. Yeah. But look, let's move on from Germany to the remaking of the entire continent. All these empires have collapsed. The new states are already emerging while they're sitting in Paris.
Yeah. I mean, it's often said that the Paris Peace Conference created Poland, or the rebirth of Poland, created Czechoslovakia, created Yugoslavia. It didn't. Those states were really creating themselves on the ground. Yugoslavia, which wasn't known as Yugoslavia until a bit later, and Czechoslovakia and Poland were establishing themselves on the ground. And basically what the peace conference did is recognize them and do some adjustments of their borders, because unfortunately, thanks to history, any of those countries in the middle of Europe at one point had been either bigger or smaller. And so they could all claim each other's territory. And that was going to lead to endless problems, and in fact, probably still does a little bit today. And so what the peace conference essentially did was simply recognize these states in the center of Europe and help to draw their borders. But the borders were really set by and large by the states themselves. I mean, Poland fought a war with Bolshevik Russia, which helped to establish that border between the two countries. They had a separate treaty, for example. And the little Baltic states, you can see them up above Poland, really established themselves and through a series again of treaties.
I hope Margaret hasn't frozen.
No, I haven't. I haven't. Sorry, I just wasn't sure if you wanted me to say anything more about the very tangled situation in the center of Europe. I mean,
Hungary in particular, but go on.
Okay, well, one of the problems was that these states were based on the ethnic principle. And so Poland was for the Poles, Czechoslovakia was for the Czechs and Slovaks, Hungary, Hungarian, Romania, Romanians, but they weren't ethnically homogeneous. And so in Czechoslovakia, you had a lot of Hungarians living. In Yugoslavia, you had Hungarians living. In Poland, you had Germans living. So one of the problems, in Romania, there were a lot of Hungarians. And so one of the problems, if the states are ethnic, what happens to the minorities? It's been estimated like something like a third of all the people living in the center of Europe were minorities in those ethnic states. And they felt, I think, often oppressed and beleaguered. Even within Czechoslovakia, the Slovaks felt the Czechs looked down on them and suppressed them. And what it meant was internal unhappiness with the minorities question. What it also meant was a temptation to interfere in each other's states. And so if you're Germany and the Germans living under Polish rule, particularly when you have a German nationalist government, and of course the Nazis were very much a German nationalist government, then they claimed to protect the Germans living under Polish rule. And the Hungarians claimed to protect the Hungarians living within Romania and so on. And so really the unhappiness in the center of Europe, I think, in a way, goes back to the establishment of these states on ethnic grounds. And there was an awful lot of squabbling and an awful lot of fighting between them. The treaty that probably is remembered most today, at least in Hungary, is the Treaty of Trianon, which is the one that Hungary, now emerging out of the wreckage of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, signed in Paris with the Allies in 1920. And for Hungary, Trianon was a disaster. Hungary lost the most of any country, most territory of any country, I think, in the First World War. A huge part of Hungary, and this map doesn't show it, but if you look to the right-hand side of Hungary, that part of Romania is Transylvania. And it was a huge part of the old Hungarian kingdom. And in Hungary, everyone knows about the Treaty of Trianon. I mean, I'm always struck when I go there. Even school children know about it, whereas most people outside Hungary have never heard of it, apart from historians. And recently, Viktor Orban had a commemoration of the Treaty of Trianon. And I think it was very much a sort of commemoration of just how unjustly we were dealt with. I mean, it's now the 100th anniversary of that treaty, and it's still felt deeply in Hungary. I don't think it's going to lead to war, but it certainly doesn't help relations between Hungary and Romania in particular.
Okay, so they left a lot of small time bombs for future generation. The Middle East, they sort of left bigger time bombs. How would you describe what borders they drew and what went on there?
Well, the Middle East is probably, if you want to do it in terms of failures of the Paris Peace Conference, the Middle East perhaps is the one that has had the most consequence for the present. The Middle East was largely, the Arab parts of the Middle East were largely controlled by the Ottoman Empire, which had, of course, been an enormously powerful empire, but by the 19th century had come to be known as the sick man of Europe. And gradually, the European parts of the Ottoman Empire, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, freed themselves or were freed with help from Ottoman rule. But the Ottomans still controlled a bit of Europe, and they controlled pretty much most of the Arab Middle East. Iran was a separate kingdom. They didn't control that, but they controlled what is today Saudi Arabia. They controlled the Gulf states. Control is taking it lightly, because in fact, they didn't always have much direct control, but they controlled what became Iraq, Jordan, Israel, Syria, and Lebanon. And so what came up at the peace conference and even before was what's going to happen to all this territory. The Ottomans were on the losing side. They had decided, perhaps wrongly, to join Germany and Austria-Hungary in the First World War, They had, in fact, often fought very bravely, but they had lost. And it was quite clear that the Ottoman Empire was consigned, as Lenin put it, to the dustbin of history. It wasn't going to survive. And so what was going to happen? And people were beginning to think about this even during the war. 3 different promises or arrangements were made during the war, which were going to complicate the history of that part of the world, and which I think still help to complicate it today. One was the promise that the British, in the person of their High Commissioner in Cairo, made to an Arab family, the Hashemite family, who were the hereditary sharifs of Mecca. And what he promised the Hashemites was that they would have an Arab kingdom if they led a revolt against the Turks. And there was an Arab revolt. And some of you may have seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, which is somewhat exaggerated, indeed a lot exaggerated, but does talk about a very important episode in history. And these are some of the people who are going to be involved in the Arab revolt. On the left-hand side is Faisal, Prince Faisal, who was a son of the Sharif of Mecca and who did fight in the desert and was also a very, as it turned out, very skillful diplomat. The woman at the top is one of the rare women who were involved in these peace settlements, and she's Gertrude Bell. And she worked for British intelligence during the First World War. She knew the Arab world very well. She traveled through it. She spoke Arabic. She was enormously well-connected. She'd made all sorts of friends throughout the world. And she was going to be very important in the formation of Iraq, and in fact, I think wrote its constitution. Below Gertrude Bell is T.E. Lawrence, here wearing Arab dress, who was a British officer assigned to Faisal. My own view is that Lawrence, very complicated character, exaggerated his own part in the Arab revolt, but he certainly played a part, and he was going to be very important in Paris. He came with Faisal and helped to, Faisal spoke a bit of French, but he came with Faisal and helped him navigate through the peace conference. And then up in the top right-hand side is a very interesting meeting between Faisal, who's standing there on the right, and this is in the Gulf of Aqaba. They had a camp there. And the other man, also wearing Arab headdress, is Chaim Weizmann, who was the leader of the World Zionist movement. And this was an early attempt to broker some sort of understanding between Arabs and Jews in the Middle East. They came to an agreement. They agreed that they could share the territory of Palestine, but it wasn't, or not share the territory of Palestine, but they would work together. It wasn't going to happen. The people who really decided the fate of the Middle East are these men down here. And these are the leading statesmen of that time. And this was a conference held in 1920. David Lloyd George is still there. Clemenceau has vanished because he's fallen out of power. And there's a different Italian prime minister. But what was going to happen to the Middle East was really going to be made in the capitals of Europe. And so the Arabs are promised, or the Hashemite family is promised, an Arab kingdom if you fight the Turks, which they did. Never clear how big that kingdom would be or how independent. And then the British and the French very quietly did a deal, and it was never a treaty, but it was sort of a deal, which is known after the 2 men who did it as Sykes-Picot, Sir Mark Sykes and Georges Picot, who did a sort of deal where Britain and France would divide up the Middle East to suit themselves. You know, they were thinking, the British and French were thinking very much in terms of 19th century imperialism. They had this attitude that people in these parts of the world didn't have a will of their own. They weren't ready to govern themselves. They would become part of one of the other empires. And the final piece of the complication is the Balfour Declaration, which Britain issued in November 1917. I think it was very much an attempt to win over US opinion and win the war. But what the declaration said was the British government, His Majesty's government, looked with favor on the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which was a province of the Ottoman Empire. And so basically 3 sets of promises which are not easily reconciled, can't be reconciled. And that, I think, helps to create the problem. The Arabs feel betrayed. They get a sort of kingdom. Faisal is briefly king of Syria, but the French boot him out of that because Syria has become part of effectively the French Empire. He then goes to Iraq, where the British try and control him. And he eventually actually manages to more or less free himself from that. But I think the Arab sense is one of betrayal. They fought the Turks and what happened to them. And the Jewish homeland in Palestine becomes, for a lot of the Arabs, a symbol of that betrayal, that part of what they thought was the Arab homeland has been set aside to make a Jewish homeland. And the British take what had been the Ottoman Empire of Palestine and they divide it up. And they create Palestine, which becomes the core of the Jewish homeland, and they create Transjordan, which eventually becomes the state of Jordan. And so what happens, I think, is imperialistic meddling creates a situation which is going to make it probably not impossible, but very, very difficult for Jews and Arabs to get on, because the Arab resentment of what's happened to them is going to be increasingly focused on the Jewish presence in Palestine. It's one of those extremely unfortunate things, and we're living with the consequences today.
And Syria and Iraq are divided by what seems to people living there as a sort of arbitrary line on the map drawn by people in Paris 100 years ago.
The worst, I think, is the case of Syria, because the French detached what had been bits. I mean, Syria actually had an existence, and it was also part of the Ottoman Empire in a certain form, but the French took parts of it and added it to Lebanon to make a greater Lebanon and to protect the Christian community in Lebanon. And that's one of the reasons the Syrians continue to want to interfere and intervene in Lebanon, because they see it as something that legitimately should be theirs. Iraq was made up of provinces of the Ottoman Empire, and the borders remain very much of those part of the Ottoman Empire. Technically, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine were what were called mandates. And so the British and French didn't rule them directly. They were awarded a mandate under the new League of Nations. But certainly the British and French tended to behave very much as if they were their colonies. And this is something which, again, I think has helped to create some of the resentment in the world today. Can I just end on a more cheerful note? Because I do think some good things come out. If I could just see the last slide, and some of you may recognize this building. This is the Palais des Nations in Geneva, and it's the home of the League of Nations. And the League is often seen as a failure. But let's remember that it was, in my view at least, a step forward. It was an attempt to bring the nations of the world together, to work together for the common good. And although it didn't prevent the Second World War, I don't think it could have done. What it did do was a lot. It helped to create or lay the foundations of the World Health Organization, the International Labor Organization. It acted very strenuously against things like slavery and gun running. And I think it helped to create the sense that nations of the world could work together. And many of its personnel and many of its institutions went over into the new United Nations, which was set up in 1945 after the end of the Second World War. So I think it was a step forward, an imperfect step, but let's end on a slightly optimistic note. You know, there was an attempt made to build a better world, and this is where that attempt was going to take place.
What struck me reading the book is the human choices and the element, therefore, of chance of these three men in a room. Would you point to one or two moments that were turning points during the talks where the world could have taken a different shape and almost did?
Well, I think there was an attempt made by Lloyd George to modify the terms of the German treaty, and he made it late, and it irritated both Clemenceau and Wilson that he'd done it because it had been so difficult to get the treaty negotiated. But what he did say was, look, we have to treat Germany more fairly. We cannot put a lot of Germans under the rule of other peoples. It will only cause troubles. And so he did make a plea for a fairer treatment of Germany. And of course, the trouble was he wasn't prepared to limit Britain's share of the reparations bill. The other thing I think that might have made a difference, but who knows, is John Maynard Keynes went to Lloyd George with a proposal which Lloyd George, I think, adopted enthusiastically, was to try and deal with the reparations issue by removing it. In other words, to come up with a deal which would make it unnecessary for the French to try and get reparations from Germany to rebuild, would make it unnecessary for Belgium to try and get reparations from Germany to rebuild, and make it unnecessary for Britain to want reparations, because what Britain had to do, it didn't need to rebuild, what it had to do was pay off its debts to the United States. The British had to borrow huge amounts of money from the United States. The British, in the meantime, had been lending money to France and to Italy and to Russia to try and keep them in the war. And so what Lloyd George, and I think he was much influenced by Keynes, said, look, why don't we just cancel all the inter-allied war debts? If the United States would say, look, wipe them clean, you don't have to pay us back, then the British wouldn't have to put pressure on the French to get their debts paid. The French wouldn't have needed the money from reparations from Germany because they would have had presumably sufficient funds to actually rebuild. Germany would have been able to rehabilitate itself. Trade would have started again. This was something Keynes really wanted. And Europe would have been a happier place. And the poisonous negotiations and resentments that surrounded reparations and also surrounded the war loans would have been removed. The United States wasn't prepared to do it. Wilson said, and his financial advisor said, look, they borrowed the money, they pay it back. It was as simple as that.
We have a question from Barry. I mean, you've made the point that pretty much everyone there is a man except the secretaries. To what degree, I mean, I suppose that's the way the world was then, to what degree did the sort of maleness of the conference shape outcomes, if at all?
I don't know. There's a lot of work now being done on gender and international relations and whether women have a different style. I'm not sure it's conclusive yet. The few women who were involved in the peace conference tended, on the whole, to echo the interests of their countries. I mean, Queen Marie of Romania came to Paris, and basically she came to get most of Hungary. She came to get Transylvania for Romania. So I don't see really a different style. I suppose the only thing different was that she tried to flirt with President Wilson, which didn't go down very well because he wasn't that sort of man. But I don't know that gender makes a great difference. I mean, you sometimes get people asking, wouldn't the world be better if women ran it? And certainly at the moment, looking at how women prime ministers have dealt with the COVID-19, you might well say there's something in that. But if you look at women who've been leaders, they have often been every bit as imperialistic, nationalistic, aggressive as male leaders. You know, think of Catherine the Great, think of Indira Gandhi, think of Golda Meir. You know, I'm not sure. But as I say, there is some really interesting work being done. And perhaps if women had been more involved, there would have been more. I mean, they do say that women have a different style, and whether it's cultural or I don't know, of wanting to get harmony and wanting to bring negotiations together. Whether that would have made a difference, I don't know.
What about Wilson? Because he's the first American president who has a sort of worldview. He sees himself as a leader of a global power.
Yeah.
And not everyone in the Senate thinks the same. Is this sort of America's coming out moment as a global power?
I think it really is. I mean, I think what is interesting is the way in which the United States, as a result of the First World War, was translating its huge economic and social and demographic power into military power. I mean, you can have countries that are very strong economically, but don't have strong militaries. And what the United States was doing as a result of the First World War was becoming a considerable military power and with considerable potential in the world. And I think the United States, it had been involved before. I mean, the Americans had been involved in a number of issues in the world before 1914. But I think this is a point at which the Americans really do get involved. Of course, their experience in Paris turns a lot of Americans off involvement because they say we went there and they ignored us. And I think that helped to feed into the American isolationism of the 1930s. But Wilson, I think, really saw, as many Americans did, I think Jefferson saw it a bit, and even earlier on, saw the United States as a force for good in the world and believed that the United States had an obligation to try and promote the values and the institutions that had made the United States such a model society. Not entirely consistent because Wilson was a Southerner and he certainly wasn't going to promote democratic and liberal values when it came to American blacks. In fact, his record as president is really not a good one at all. He reversed a number of moderate steps that had been taken in the federal civil service to segregate them even more.
Lastly, on Wilson, he was in your business before. He was, I think, a professor of international relations. Was he a good one?
Apparently, he was a very good professor. He was a political scientist, and then he ran Princeton University and apparently did it very well. I mean, he's a very, very complicated man, and I think probably very difficult. I mean, he had a propensity to fall out with anyone who disagreed with him. And if you disagreed with him, he tended to think you were not just wrong, but evil. And that, I think, was unfortunate. So I think, you know, he had a number of character flaws, and I think wrongly, he made the Paris Peace Conference a partisan affair. It was only Democrats, really, that he listened to and took there. And he didn't bring the Republicans in. And I think that was a big mistake. And that's one of the reasons the treaty didn't get through the Senate.
Margaret, thank you immensely. That is the most concise run through of 1919 that anyone's ever going to get. We are very grateful. Before we unmute everyone to say thanks, Pamela, and I also want to thank particularly Derek Shearer, who brokered this whole event. Friend of Margaret's, friend of ours. Thank you, Derek, for making all this happen. We all owe you.